Let's talk about Dark Souls 3 and Fanservice. Now this video will contain spoilers, so I'd advise you to play through Dark Souls 3 on its own before watching any further, and if you want a quick review, then here it is. Taken on its own merits without thinking about the pandering or the reuse of some elements from the previous games in the series, I truly believe that Dark Souls 3 is probably the best in the series, including Bloodborne, if only because I can't play Bloodborne at 60 FPS. Dark Souls 3 has been out for just over a month, and as a huge fan of the Soulsborne series, I'm bound to pick up on some of the references and callbacks to the previous entries. Playing through the game with a live chat which hesitates to spoil things, but will still point out references I might have missed whilst we discuss our lore theories, definitely helps this, so credit goes to my regulars for some of this information as well. Going back to Dark Souls 2 for a minute, it tried to distance itself from its predecessor in many ways. The locations were all very different for better or worse. But in the midst of all this change, you had the Sun Bros, which somehow after all this time, between the first and the second game, the only remnant of Dark Souls 1 is the fan favourite Solaire. Of course this immediately stuck out as pandering, which made me cringe rather than having the intended effect of excitement. I was extremely disappointed in Dark Souls 2 overall, so this was just adding to my list of annoyances with it. So let's just move on to Dark Souls 3. Hearing that Miyazaki was back made me confident once again in the monster and level design, but I still had to question how much fanservice there would be in this installment. The answer? There's much more fanservice for every previous Souls game in Dark Souls 3 than there ever was in Dark Souls 2, yet the majority of it is handled much better, so let's discuss why. Let's get this out of the way first. Yes, the Sun Bros are back, and it's basically a part of the lore now that somehow Solaire created the Sunlight Covenant and became a legend in the game world the same way he did in ours. While the parallels here are sweet, I'm still really tired of praising the sun. However, the first bit of fanservice begins right after the first boss with Firelink Shrine. The name alone is a callback to Dark Souls 1's hub of the same, and there's probably a lore reason for this that I'm too stupid to get, but for me, calling the new hub Firelink Shrine just seemed unnecessary more than anything. It doesn't add anything for me, nor does it really distract. It just seems like a strange choice considering how different the areas look and are designed. This hub doesn't actually link to any of the other levels, it's separate from the rest of the world, unlike in Dark Souls 1. This appears to be one of the many mysteries of Dark Souls 3 though. Finding the untended graves later on after the fight with Osiris seems to imply that this is a version of the hub which actually exists in the world, calling into question how real our new Firelink Shrine actually is. Before moving on, I'd like to say that I absolutely love the look of Firelink Shrine in this game. The lighting, the atmosphere, and especially the 5 thrones looming over you as you enter are all done incredibly well, and I've always loved the feeling of progression that comes from adding to or destroying something in a hub, like the statues in Shadow of the Colossus, or adding the ashes of each Lords of Cinder here. Andre the Blacksmith though, this was some of the easiest fan service to include. Why is he here? Something to do with souls of this world sticking around when they have a purpose or some shit like that. Maybe at a later date he'll be more fleshed out by the community. But for now, it feels like he was just thrown in to play in the nostalgia of fans. Mechanically, he serves the same purpose in the same way, so there's nothing to complain about there, but also nothing new or interesting to get into.
Hey, be careful. I don't want to see my work squandered.
Similarly, Havel is included in Archdragon Peak as an optional fight. Much like Andre, he doesn't really serve any purpose besides playing on nostalgia, but at least it's a better use than he had in Dark Souls 2. The only other content of this ilk that I can think of is the Stray Demon, although this one is a bit less egregious for a few reasons, those being the fact that in this game it isn't an actual boss like it could have been, since there were 3 in the original game, and the model has been changed to look very distinct, along with a few new moves added. I would have liked to see a similar approach with Havel, even if it was just a change to his armour to make it look more weathered. Let's briefly cover the nods to Demon Souls. Of course, the Firekeeper at your hub is reminiscent of the Maiden in Black, because she's also blind. More so than ever after Bloodborne, this feels like it's part of tradition, a woman in the player's hub used for some exposition, but primarily for leveling up, and I've got nothing against these characters, and the blind Firekeepers are baked into the Dark Souls lore at this point, but I do miss the convenience of leveling up at bonfires that FromSoft seem to have regressed from, because I guess they wanted to throw fans back to Demon Souls more often. Playing on PC, these loading screens are quick and not much of a barrier to leveling up, but I remember being frustrated by the same problem in Bloodborne because of the console loading times. To avoid this frustration, primarily for console players, I would rather the Firekeeper be used for increasing the power of and reinforcing your Estus Flask count. Then it feels as though she still has purpose without needing to go to a completely different area just to increase a single stat point. On the plus side, Firelink Shrine is much nicer to return to than Majula in Dark Souls 2 thanks to a wider cast of NPCs going in and out of the area with updated dialogue as you progress, so it's worth checking in on them whenever you come back even if it was originally just to level up. There's another nod to Demon Souls hidden in the Untended Graves area, as if the Firekeeper wasn't enough of a maiden in black, we see the character herself, well, almost definitely not actually her, but she's got the eyes covered in wax and everything. This is the sort of fanservice I'd actually like to see more of. While I'm sure stuff like this just fucks with the lore of the series even more, I enjoy these little Easter eggs much more so than reusing the same characters like the Firekeeper, which can impact the gameplay mechanics in a negative fashion. More characters adding to tradition and arguably a lack of creativity are Patches and the Crestfallen Knight, who both return in this game. I don't really have a problem with this either, to be honest. I will be more bothered by the depressed knight returning, but he has more of a character to him than any of the previous incarnations, especially after discovering that he's part of the Dragon Covenant and will actually fight you to gain the power to transform into one. Well, their version of a dragon in this anyway. Patches has always been an annoying yet enjoyable character for me, and his interactions with both Siegward and Grey Rat make for a compelling side quest for those willing to see it through.
I'm unbreakable, Patches. Nobody can crack me. Why me? Why me?
So let's move on to the biggest piece of fanservice, Anor Londo. After having it spoiled for me and then again by an actual NPC, I thought I'd straight up hate this retreading a lot more than I actually did. Instead I found it to be a stunning recreation of a small segment, completely redone with new models and textures, plus it was condensed enough that I don't feel it detracted that much from me seeing new and original content. Aldrich was a fun boss as well, and seeing it take place in the decrepit arena that once housed one of the best boss fights in Dark Souls was a great way to hit home how disgusting Aldrich is with how he consumes and destroys everything in his path. However, after seeing the preview of him in the opening cutscene, I expected something much more grotesque, because seeing yet another humanoid-esque enemy felt like a missed opportunity. When all the other Lords of Cinder seemed more prestigious, he could have been a stark contrast and been something truly different, no longer even resembling a human, whereas in this he does at least from the waist up. So one direction in Irithyll gets you Dark Souls fanservice, while the other gets you Demon Souls fanservice. I'm of course talking about Irithyll Dungeon, which is eerily similar to the Tower of Latria, down to the animations for opening cells. Although the lantern carriers here are far more intimidating by having the ability to lower your health bar to a tiny amount. While the area shares a lot of similarities with Latria, it's enough of a departure that it's both enjoyable as an homage and an area all of its own, with solid level design and atmosphere. Jumping right to the end of the game, we have the Soul of Cinder at the Kiln of the First Flame. At this point I was so in love with Dark Souls 3 that I was just amazed at seeing this area again. It was a huge surprise. Oh, what the fuck? Looking back, however, I would have much preferred an entirely new area to end the game off on. It feels like a huge piece of fanservice, which is most evident in the second half of the final boss's fight, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Part of me still sticks by this initial reaction. The area itself is definitely a revisit, but not quite as similar as Anor Londo. In fact, it reminds me more of the Bloodborne DLC, with the strange amalgamation of buildings in the background, which is definitely some beautiful imagery, and the primary difference between this and the Dark Souls 1 rendition. The Soul of Cinder is a brilliant boss in its first half, testing all of your skills that you've acquired throughout the game by essentially switching between every class in the game, complete with a transforming weapon and spells. But then you get through the first health bar and the boss becomes Gwyn for reasons. I adore the way they sneak Gwyn's theme into this fight, but I really don't think the entire boss should have become essentially a redo of Gwyn. Personally, I would have been happier with him having one health bar with twice the amount of health and never becoming Gwyn, as fighting against this is far more interesting and varied to me. I also pine for a Souls game that ends with a ridiculously huge boss and not simply a one-on-one fight with another humanoid. I've loved these boss designs, but I'd like to be surprised with the final boss in whatever FromSoft does next. And those are my thoughts on Dark Souls 3 and its fanservice, but there's an important quote that impacted my opinion on all of this, and it comes from one of the channel regulars, Zavilas. He said that if you think of Dark Souls 3 as a true sequel to Dark Souls, pretending that Dark Souls 2 doesn't even exist, then all of these decisions seem much less like pandering and more like a natural sequel with connections to the previous game in the series. This gave me a new perspective on things. Dark Souls 2 tried to be so different that it conditioned me to believe that another sequel would have a similar approach, but with the reintroduction of Miyazaki as the director, it simply feels like a true Dark Souls sequel, a continuation of the story, much more so than a departure. That's why I've not mentioned the obvious connections such as the Abyss Watchers carrying on Artorias' legacy. I love that boss, and it's not a simple redo of Artorias like it could have been. There's plenty of other connections that I don't have time to list, but they all come from Dark Souls 3 being a true sequel, set in a place that doesn't feel too far from Lordran. It may have played it safer than any other game in the series, but I think Dark Souls 3 benefits from this. The refinements made to almost every system and consistently fantastic level design and bosses make this my favourite Souls game. If you don't like how similar it is in parts to the first, then hey, Bloodborne was released only a year ago, and FromSoft are currently working on a new IP, so I think there's enough to satisfy everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Please like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. What are your thoughts on Dark Souls 3 and the connections it has to the first? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And hey, if you want another kind of editorial like this, then you can click on the left to see my thoughts on Metal Gear Solid 5's change in priorities, or click on the right to see the playlist of my Dark Souls 3 playthrough. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.